Hey, and my name is Tomás Insua. I serve as Global Coordinator of the Global Catholic Climate Movement. We're delighted to have you all here join us for our very first Divest, Reinvest webinar titled Caring for Creation by Divesting from Fossil Fuels and Reinvesting in Climate Solutions. We are convening this webinar together with our friends from GCCM. And well, this is our very first time that we convene such a webinar on this very important issue. Just to get started, at GCCM, we always start with we get started with a prayer. So I invite you all to join us for this prayer, to keep in mind why we're coming together today, why we are trying to bring Laudato Si to life. So we can't think of a better prayer than this beautiful prayer for our earth from Pope Francis in Laudato Si. So I invite you to join me in all together praying this beautiful prayer for our earth. So it says, all-powerful God, you're present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we're profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen. Thanks for joining us in this prayer. I think it's important to set the tone of why we're here and what we're aiming to do. So just to get us started, just would like to briefly remind all of us of this very important quotes that we're seeing on the screen that provide the motivation for doing this work. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with GCCM, with the Global Catholic Climate Movement, but we're a network of over 350 Catholic organizations all around the world. And we started working very recently, only 4 or 5 months ago, in promoting fossil fuel divestment and reinvestment in renewable energy. And the motivation is simply from Laudato Si, and specifically from this quote from Pope Francis, who calls for the progressive replacement without delay of highly polluting fossil fuels. I think Laudato Si is, as we'll hear probably from our panelists in our first panel, Laudato Si provides a very strong moral case for fossil fuel divestment and reinvestment. And then it's important to keep in mind this very important quote as well from the bishops. I don't know how many of you recall, but last October, all the Catholic bishops' conferences of the world, represented through the bishops' conferences, regional bishops' conferences, released this very powerful statement calling for an end to the fossil fuel era. And also they called for renewable energy access for all. This is a very powerful statement that, all the bishops already did the heavy lifting for making the case for fossil fuel divestment, I think, with this powerful quote. I think it's very self-explanatory. So we just need to connect the dots about how that translates to our investment policies. So that said, we are working on so I would like to remind everyone that next October 4th, the Feast of St. Francis of Assisi, will have our next joint divestment announcement. We are facilitating this with a few groups. There are several Catholic institutions that already confirmed that they will announce their divestment commitments by this date. We'll have already several Catholic institutions, mostly religious orders, from at least 4 countries: Canada, Australia, Italy, and I'm missing the 4th country, and the UK. So hopefully this webinar can be of inspiration for you and your organization to make such a divestment commitment and join us on that date. And of course, if October 4th is too soon, in a month, there will be another joint divestment announcement happening on Ash Wednesday next year on March 1st. So, and the objective of this joint announcement is just to build momentum and raise awareness about this important issue and try to get even more Catholic institutions, so also other Christian and faith institutions as well, to do it afterwards. So that said, without further delay, I think it will be much more interesting to hear from our wonderful panelists. As a reminder, we'll have 2 panels today. The first panel will be about the moral case for fossil fuel divestment. We'll hear from Reverend Jenny Phillips, Koreti and Nancy Rourke. I will be introducing them as they speak, and then we'll have a quick session of Q&A. So you'll be able to, if you have questions, by the way, you'll see in your screens that you have a Q&A box. You can, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit your questions through that venue, and in the Q&A session we can go through those questions. And then that will be the first half of the webinar will be this panel, and the second half of the webinar will be the next panel, which will be about case studies of Christian institutions that divested and reinvested. So we want to go into the practicalities of what it takes to divest and also to reinvest, and the details. So we want to hear from those who already did it. So we have a wonderful panel as well for that. So going back to our first panel then, we'll hear first from Reverend Jenny Phillips. Jenny is GreenFaith's Divest and Reinvest Now Program Director, and she founded Fossil Free UMC, which is the United Methodist Movement to Divest from Fossil Fuels. So Jenny has been doing excellent work getting the word out in the faith community for many years already. She's a United Methodist minister with a Master of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary in New York. And Jenny lives in Seattle, Washington. So we should thank Jenny for waking up so early. It's 5 a.m. over there. And by the way, I should mention that Koreti as well is on the other side of the planet in New Zealand. So we have a very international panel. Well, Jenny, that's it. The floor is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Hello. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm cheating a little bit. I flew to Chicago yesterday, so now it's 7 a.m. where I am, although my brain is still in Seattle. At any rate, I'm very happy to be here with you. I am the program director for GreenFaith's Divest and Reinvest Now program, and we're delighted to be co-sponsoring this webinar with GCCM. For GreenFaith, it's the first in a series of faith-based divest-invest webinars that we'll be sharing over the next few months. I'm just going to take a moment to shift slides. Bear with me, please. So GreenFaith has been working on fossil fuel divestment since 2012. We encourage, resource, and track faith-based fossil fuel divestment campaigns worldwide. Through our work, we provide the tools that leaders need to bring the divestment conversation to their communities and to respond to the tough questions that inevitably emerge when we have these conversations. We have deep roots with divestment campaigns, primarily with Christian communities in the global north. And we're starting to work with Buddhist, Hindu, and Muslim communities, particularly in the global south. So again, many thanks for welcoming me today. I'll be discussing a bit about the basics of fossil fuel divestment and the moral case for it. But I'll really be giving a broad strokes overview, while my colleagues on the panel, I expect, will go deeper into the theology and ethics of Catholic investing and divesting and how they relate to Laudato Si. So what is fossil fuel divestment? When institutions invest money, they buy stocks, bonds, or other investments that generate income. So to divest is just the opposite of what it means to invest, to get rid of particular stocks, bonds, and other investments. Well, who's divesting? So far, more than 557 institutions and 50,000 individuals have made public commitments to fossil fuel divestment. Those funds together total $3.4 trillion. And there have been 126 faith institutions that have made some sort of divestment commitment in 2015 alone. Here are some notable faith commitments of the many that have already been made, but there's potential for so much more. In 2009, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said that religious institutions are the third largest category of investor. They own up to 8% of the world's habitable land, 5% of forests, and they run or support more than half the world's schools. This, in addition to the ways in which their values influence people, mean that divestment has a potential to be a really powerful tool for change. So why do these faith communities divest? Well, first, divestment is a way to respond to intentional, grave, large-scale harm. Religious groups have a history of divesting from companies that regularly and intentionally undertake activities that injure or kill a large number of people, often groups of people that are vulnerable and marginalized. They also divest as a response to intractable resistance after multiple change efforts have failed. These other efforts can include legislative, regulatory, and shareholder advocacy. Religious communities have been engaging in shareholder advocacy with fossil fuel giants for more than 25 years, but still the most basic resolutions calling for change are failing. This year alone, shareholders in ExxonMobil and Chevron brought resolutions calling for stress tests to determine the risks that climate change poses to their businesses. It's just stress tests for the businesses. It's so basic and designed to protect the business rather than the planet. But even these resolutions have failed. In addition, the process of divestment redefines society's moral code. It delegitimizes investment in certain companies and exhibits disgust with their practices. And public rejection of immoral practices is really important when we're trying to change the rules of society. So why do they do it? Divestment creates the cultural, political, and social will needed to enact strong climate legislation. And it demonstrates a sacrificial commitment to religious, moral, and social values. It comes to a point where a community will say, we refuse to profit from this immoral activity. Now, using economic systems to express values is nothing new for religious communities. In the early days of slavery, Quakers were among the prominent slave traders and holders, but they spent nearly 100 years fighting an internal battle over the morality of slavery. And the conflict over the issue ultimately resulted in the development of a new generation of abolitionists who lobbied for the first emancipation statute. The Methodist Church is one of a number of traditions that screens sin stocks, with a history of socially responsible investing dating back to the 18th century and still active today, although we haven't yet divested from fossil fuels. And while I expect others on this panel will speak in greater depth on Catholic socially responsible investing, I want to note that the US Catholic bishops were leaders in urging divestment from businesses tied with apartheid. Their and other religious and secular divestment campaigns of the 80s brought attention to the US government's apathy toward apartheid. In the Anglican Church, Archbishop Desmond Tutu was known for his opposition to apartheid. He supported divestment from companies supporting apartheid in the 80s. And now in recent years, he's called people of faith and conscience to divest from fossil fuels. I mentioned at the beginning that Green Faith helps people respond to common objections related to fossil fuel divestment. Many of these intersect with the moral case for divestment, so I wanted to share a few of them. Many people will ask if it's hypocritical to stop investing in fossil fuels when so many people depend on them. How can you say it's wrong when you drove your car today or used fossil fuels? We say it's not hypocritical. We know that ending fossil fuel dependence requires a multi-pronged approach. In many parts of the world, current infrastructure does not support a low carbon lifestyle. If we had more affordable, convenient choices for sustainable transportation and energy, most people would choose them. So this is about calling for systems change. Now, some suggest our values call us to stay at the table and remain engaged with fossil fuel companies through shareholder advocacy. But in this situation, shareholder advocacy can't work. Most of the world's fossil fuel reserves need to stay in the ground. The problem is the product. This isn't like asking Nike to stop making shoes in sweatshops. It's like we're asking Nike to stop making shoes. And finally, what about energy access for people in the developing world? Our response is that the church should be investing in sustainable energy infrastructure in developing nations, rather than saddling them with energy solutions that have no future in a low carbon world. So how are faith leaders responding? Well, a couple of years ago, faith leaders, theologians, and ethicists issued a statement calling for fossil fuel divestment and clean energy reinvestment. That statement is on the Green Faith website, and it reads in part, because of the grave threat of climate change and the fossil fuel sector's unyielding refusal to change, it is no longer right for religious groups to profit from companies that with certainty are creating ecological destruction and human suffering on such a titanic scale. But it's not only religious leaders that are calling on faith communities to divest. In a 2014 article in The Guardian, former UN climate chief Christiana Figueres made a passionate plea for faith leaders to recognize the intersection between their commitment to hunger, poverty, relief, and development, and climate change. She says that it's time for faith groups and religious institutions to find their voice and set their moral compass on one of the great humanitarian issues of our time. Her call is a reminder that the world is watching what we do as people of faith in response to this critical issue. We're framing the moral discussion for everyone. Now, I know my colleagues on this panel have much more to share about all that Catholic theology and scripture bring to bear on this issue. So it feels right to pass the mic and screen to them to dig deeper into the immense resources of your tradition. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jenny. Very much appreciated. Thanks for that great overview and intro to fossil fuel divestment and reinvestment. So excellent. So next we'll hear from Koreti. Koreti is the Pacific Regional Coordinator of 350.org. She's joining us from New Zealand today, and she's a coordinator of the Pacific Climate Warriors, the well-known network of climate activists with representatives from 15 Pacific Islands and Australia and New Zealand. So, and Koreti will be making the case for fossil fuel divestment from the perspective of the South, of the Pacific Islands. So, Koreti, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Tomás. And yeah, thanks everybody for being on board. There's a big group out there, and apologies, it's after midnight for me, but I didn't want to pass up this great opportunity to talk about our role in the Pacific. We're in a unique position in the Pacific in that obviously we are on the front lines of climate change. We are feeling the impacts of climate change. We don't have huge investments in fossil fuel industries, nor do we have much by way of extraction, except of course in Australia and some in Papua New Guinea. For us, being able to mobilize and empower Pacific communities through our faith networks, which is what also unites us. Not only are we united by an ocean and by our area, by our region in the world, and by the impacts that we feel, but we are very much connected by faith. And so what might work for the climate movement in most Western countries don't necessarily apply to the Pacific. We needed to find a way that we could really bring the topic of climate change to the people, because only those in urban areas of the Pacific Islands were really aware about what climate change was. For the majority of our people in the Pacific, the problem of climate change was very much just, the will of God, a change in weather patterns or whatever other reason, but not the fact that what was happening in the Western world was connected to the extreme weather and sea level rise, etc. And it's really bad weather here, so my windows are rattling. So what we strove to do, what we feel our place was really to be the voice of frontlines grassroots communities. And in order to do that, in order to be that voice, we needed to connect really strongly with our people and in a very real and genuine way. So last year, we embarked on a journey where we wanted to collect our frontline truths. And I just want to share a link here. Sorry, I'm going to just, I've shared a link there called Frontline Truths with everybody. We collected stories from our most vulnerable communities in each of our Pacific Islands. And some of those stories are shared on this link that I've just shared with you. And what we did was we collected the stories and wove mats, because all of our another thing that connects us is our traditions and our cultures is our weaving. And we wove mats and use these mats as the vessels to carry our stories of frontline truths and of impacted communities. And we took a journey to the Vatican in October of last year. Funnily enough, just in time for the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi, where we celebrated it in Assisi with the People's Pilgrimage, Ibsanyo, before embarking on a 3-day prayer vigil in St. Peter's Square, where we used the mats that we took as prayer mats and held our 3-day vigil where we uplifted the islands of which these mats came from, the climate struggle, the leaders of these islands, and also the leaders of big polluting nations that were going to be attending COP21 in France last year. And we did that because we did that without a lot of media attention and without a whole lot of hoopla, because that right there was an action that was really for our people and to connect our people to the struggle, to the movement. What's led on from that is that at the moment we are having our Pray for Our Pacific campaign, where we invited we invited faith communities from throughout the Pacific and throughout the world who wanted to join us between the 3rd and the 11th of September to pray for the Pacific, to pray for our Pacific in whatever capacity. And we had hoped to get 50 registrations to join. We currently have 109 registrations and faith groups still registering. And some of those faith groups have also included Hindu and Muslim communities in the Pacific. And we're very excited about that. We know that part of our role is to be the moral witness and to share the story of what the impacts of climate change is on our communities. Last week, I was able to, I delivered a 3-day divestment workshop training, in Korea. And I don't know a lot about divestment, but what I was able to support and prepare this group for was to be able to think outside of what is happening, think outside of what is happening in places like China, because we had representatives from China, from Japan, and to show them that being able to get these big corporations, that these big fossil fuel companies, to be able to take the money away from those companies supports, they do it not only for the area, but they do it, for our people in the Pacific as well. This is an issue that impacts us all, and we need to support each other. We need each other. Everybody needs each other to be able to tackle this, from, this problem, from all problems, and to be able to have faith communities from throughout the Pacific, Australia and New Zealand supporting these movements allows us to also to build it. In building this foundation, it's allowing us to then be able to begin wider conversations with people that previously were not having these conversations, previously were not aware of the impact of those investments of their churches, and to be able to make those all-important asks about where their tithes go. Because it is the people in the church, who support the church, who give the tithes, and they should be able to have a say in where that money goes. And that's what we're aiming to do, to be able to build a solid foundation of faith communities who will tackle the climate, the issue of climate change on as many levels as we can, both spiritual and financial. Because that is the best way that the Pacific can contribute. You can find out more about that journey that we made in Rome by going to our 350 Pacific website and our Facebook page, where there's lots of beautiful images of our time in Rome. And it's been a real honor to be a part of this tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Koreti. Wonderful. Thanks for sharing. So important to keep in mind the frontline communities when making these decisions about divestment and reinvestment. Let's please keep in mind the frontline communities, especially. So that said, we'll go next to our last speaker of this first panel, Nancy Rourke. Nancy teaches. She's based in Buffalo, New York. She teaches Catholic ethics at Canisius College and is a member of the Catholic Theological Society of America. Nancy's PhD is from the St. Patrick's University of Maynooth, Ireland. She's writing a book on Catholic environmental virtue ethics and is working with her local parishes to increase ecological awareness in her diocese. So that said, Nancy will be making the case for fossil fuel divestment from a Catholic perspective. So thanks for joining us, Nancy.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody, and thanks to the panelists especially for these really useful, thoughtful and hopeful presentations. I have slides that I'd like to show while I'm doing this, so I'm going to pull those up for you. So you've heard mentioned a few times already Pope Francis's recent encyclical Laudato Si, and I would recommend you read it if you have any time at all to try, because it's very readable and enjoyable. But if you don't have any interest, at least let me tell you one thing that summarizes it. Everything is connected. He says this over and over again all through the encyclical, everything is connected. And that is why thinking about divestment is so complicated, because every decision relates to every other decision. But it's also why thinking about divestment is so important. So here's my little plan that I want to try to get through this morning, today, wherever you are. I want to talk about the ethics of investment from a few perspectives, and then at the end give some more practical, specific guidelines and principles for Catholic responses to fossil fuels when it comes to investment. So some of the science, I am sure, is familiar to all of you already, right? We know that climate change, according to the IPCC fifth assessment report, has already warmed the Earth. We know that it has warmed it by something like 0.9 degrees or 0.85 degrees or something like that. We know that changes are happening already. You've heard those attested to, and now you've seen the link that you can look at to hear more specific stories from the front line of what's been happening. It may be that you've experienced some of these things that could be called climate change, and it may be that you haven't, but it is happening. It's happening everywhere, and it is affecting the poor first and worst. To be more specific about the effects on the poor of these changes, we already can imagine that those who live in poverty have difficulty adapting to and recovering from, much less escaping from, some of the dire effects of climate change. We know that fossil fuels can create immense health risks. We see statistics here on this slide about indoor air pollution, what that can do to people. But on the other hand, if energy and the side effects of fuels burning can be this detrimental, it's possible that the side effects of an energy culture could be really beneficial. A clean energy system can improve health. It can reduce energy poverty. It can give more access to energy to people who need it. It can create energy independence. It can enable job creation for those nations with an economy that sort of thinks in terms of that. Regardless, a shift in energy sourcing is needed in order to stabilize the climate. So where does the church stand on this? The Catholic Church recognizes the scientific consensus about climate change, about its cause, about the connection between fossil fuels, emission into the atmosphere, and the changes in climate globally. And we also know that a massive shift is necessary, and a shift to renewable energy, to sustainable energy sources, in order to protect the climate. And there are some guidelines that I've listed here to indicate what kind of protection, what kind of a shift is needed. This looks a little dire, so I think I should also highlight that there are some reasons for hope. It may be that taking action right now could ease some of the worst consequences. And that matters. Avoiding all of the consequences is impossible. The consequences are already underway. But avoiding the worst of the worst possible consequences is important. It's very important. Halting emissions in 2016 could allow atmospheric carbon dioxide to reduce down to 350 parts per million. Some scientists are arguing, and then you see the source on the bottom from which this is taken, that improved agriculture and forestry practices could help global temperature rise to be only 1 degree Celsius by the end of this century, if there's no net increase of the non-CO2 greenhouse gases, methane and things like that. So there's some reason to hope. There's some reason to realize that taking action now can make a difference. So let's think more about where we would think about this coming from a Catholic perspective. I'll look at 3 different kinds of sources to think about theology and energy ethics here. First, the magisterial sources. Magisterial sources are important when you're talking about Catholic ethics. The magisterium produces the documents that speak on behalf of the church. And turns out there is a lot already that we have that's been written and given to the world from the church, speaking on behalf of the church about these issues. There's a list here from 1972 forward to the Bishop's Appeal that Tomás had already mentioned a few minutes ago. And of course, most recently, last spring, we have Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. And some of the paragraph numbers that you could look to are listed here. There's an urgent need to develop policies to limit emissions. Fossil fuel technology needs to be replaced progressively without delay. So there is a moral mandate more specifically for quote-unquote advanced nations, for developed nations. We see in paragraph 52 of Laudato Si, the developed countries ought to pay their ecological debt by significantly limiting their consumption of non-renewable energy. The ecological debt refers to the reality that industrialized nations have been disproportionately consuming and emitting, consuming fossil fuels and emitting greenhouse gases into the air. And that creates a debt to the rest of the planet, a debt to the poor, a debt to the planet itself. We also see from the Pontifical Council of Justice and Peace, the advanced countries have a moral duty in particular to develop the use of the most complex and capital-intensive energy technologies. As other panelists have already noted, the responsibility differs for each nation for where a person is standing. Now to turn to the ethical categories in traditional Catholic thought. Some people may respond, okay, yeah, it's important for the Catholic Church to put its money where its mouth is and to avoid participating in evil actions by corporations, but this isn't like an intrinsically evil act. This isn't one of those, like going out and murdering somebody, right? So this isn't exactly the same kind of thing, some may argue. Well, on the other hand, we have comments from bishops and from a body of church teaching that counteracting structural harm and doing things like alleviating poverty is not actually optional or secondary, even when the impacts, the consequences seem a little indirect, or even when it's not an intrinsically evil act. We're not talking about one specific action when we're talking about carbon dioxide emission, of course. We're talking about a structure, a system of energy production. Well, some might say investing is supposed to bring benefit after all. So, aren't we supposed to invest with an eye to benefiting ourselves? All right. However, the second bullet point here, investors who are seeking maximum returns are in fact cooperating with the intention of a fossil fuel company to exploit all the existing resources that that company can possibly reach. Cooperating with an evil intention is a serious problem in every tradition of Catholic moral theology. And finally, you might say, okay, but cooperating with intention isn't the same thing as going out and doing something wrong myself. So are you really going to talk about it in the same kind of terms? Isn't it kind of a remote sort of cooperation? Well, then there's the last point to consider here, the last bullet point. Structural impacts, these kinds of consequences that come from social structures like our energy production and distribution system are socially intensified. So while the church does have a tradition of recognizing the remoteness within which we may participate in what other people are doing, on the other hand, the intensity, the overwhelming consequence of what's being done here needs to be taken into account. The impacts are not remote at all when you think about the fact that fossil fuels are implicated in almost every single act of the top 4 billion energy consumers in the developed world, including, for example, people like me. Reasons to think about this in a different way, reasons to think about this in terms of divestment. There's the institutional of the Catholic Church, which is being an institution of charity. There is a unity that comes with us to identifying ourselves as the body of Christ. We have many outstanding institutions in the church who are committed to service and to helping the poor. We're proud of them because whether or not we're directly involved with them, we see them working on behalf of ourselves. We see them working all together. So there's already an implication of cooperation in the unity of the church. So we carry out our faith not only as individuals, we carry it out through the groups, the organizations, and the institutions that we belong to, through all different kinds of ways of being involved with them. It's not separate from our faith, it's the way we do faith. So what kind of guidelines would there be for Catholic institutions thinking about what to invest in and what not to invest in? Good guidelines would be pragmatic and purposeful. What do we mean by pragmatic engagement with the issues? Well, here are some statistics about the votes that were blocked that Reverend Phillips mentioned at the very beginning of this discussion, things that never made it to a vote, and the point that she made that engagement in order to change the product is what matters. Changing the process isn't going to help when the product is the problem. On the other hand, it's also true that as investors, it's possible to use platforms for policy advocacy. So we have some gradients of recommendation here first. That all Catholic institutions need to advocate for a carbon price of some sort and an end to fossil fuel subsidies and full support of the Green Climate Fund. There needs to be broad corporate responsibility policies in effect right now for all Catholic institutions. And it's possible also to keep in mind that as shareholders, voting to influence the ways in which corporations can proceed is another possible way to work. And this is going to depend on where an organization is, what the circumstances are in that particular location. For USCCB investment, that is to say investment on the part of the US bishops, it's important to remember that economy and environment have to always be considered together. Again, as Pope Francis said, everything is connected. And to remember that as we take part in what corporations are doing, we're participating in these corporations in some kind of a way, and that needs to be a part of our consideration of how to decide what kind of relationship to be in with them. So there are two possible courses of action that are recommended here. You could refuse to invest in companies or divest from such companies. It's always important in Catholic institutions to be thinking about what kinds of impression we're giving about what we stand for, what we believe in, and to be thinking about the scandal that could be caused if we act in ways that don't fit what we say we believe in, if we act in ways that indicate that we're only pretending to believe what it is that we say we believe. Second, there's the possibility of active corporate participation. Under this approach, the conference would seek to exercise its normal shareholder activities by voicing what kind of a direction a corporation ought to go. One way to do this would be to set some limits for each Catholic organizations thinking about what kind of corporation to be involved in financially. And within and underneath those limits to know that there's sort of a degree of evil within which we ought not participate. Those are the thoughts that I have for now. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Nancy. Super helpful to have that background and framing for Catholic engagement on this issue. Super useful. So that said, I'll now pass the word to Thea Almarod. Thea will be moderating the next panel. So we'll have a session of Q&A directly at the end with all panelists. So yeah, the second panel will be about the case studies. So just a quick background on Thea. She's joining us from Australia. She's the chair of the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change. Thea is a social worker and longtime Catholic social justice advocate. She's currently president of ARRCC, which is multi-faith and has been campaigning for divestment by faith-based organizations for over 3 years. So Thea, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Tomás. They were brilliant presentations up till now. I'm very conscious, though, that we're running a little over time, so I'll ask the next presenters to be as concise as possible so that there is time for questions and answers at the end. The first speaker is Simon Scott, who's the business manager for the Passionist Fathers, Holy Spirit Province, for the last 18 months. Before that, he was the general manager of a golf club and the CEO of a charity after starting his career in retail property management. He's a chartered accountant by qualification, but at the moment he's happy to delegate the debits and credits these days. So handing it over to Simon Scott. Go ahead, Simon.
Sorry, can you see me?
Yep.
Yes, great, thank you. Thank you, Thea. I do not have slides to share, so you'll just have the pleasure of my face for the next 8 minutes or so. Briefly, the Passionist Fathers, Catholic order established in 1720 by St. Paul of the Cross, and there are over 2,000 men across the world, across 59 countries. The Holy Spirit Province, which I'm representing tonight, covers the areas of Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea and Vietnam. In Australia, it's a relatively small order. We have about 55 men, and the average age of our men is 72 and heading north, which seems to be common for a lot of religious these days. Why am I here tonight, part of this panel? I was a bit surprised when Thea asked initially for the Passionists to be involved, because we are a small organisation, and I thought there might be opportunities for bigger organisations with greater experience. And I'm certainly looking forward to hearing from John and Betsy later on about their experiences in the US. But I suppose on reflection, I felt that we do have a story to tell because we are a small order, and there are probably hundreds of small orders out there who are going through the same sort of thought processes and issues that we're facing in trying to decide on how we can go about divesting and addressing climate change issues. So I'll talk a little bit about our journey so far. The Passionists have been aware of environmental issues, obviously, for many years, like most orders, and the awareness has only just grown as the science comes in on climate change and the impact that fossil fuel emissions have on climate change. With this in mind, my predecessor approached our investment managers on several occasions asking if they could provide us with opportunities to be more ethically invested. And basically, I think he met with quite a bit of apathy from those investment managers who said that the renewable energy sector is still very young, and therefore they couldn't guarantee the same sort of returns that the typical portfolios would return. But the process hasn't stopped with that, and the reason we're moving forward is because our provincial, Father Tom McDonough, is passionate about this, and I think his passion has been reignited or helped by Thea's involvement in recent months. I think probably in the last 18 months, she has been providing him with the support and direction to really try and keep the momentum going, and Tom has obviously passed that on through to me. So even though we did come to the conclusion we want to do something proactive about this, it has still taken over 12 months to get to the stage where we are actively engaged with an ethical fund that's divested from fossil fuel extraction investments. And the process required a lot of research. One of the hardest parts was coming to agreement on exactly what we did and didn't want to be invested in. And also, very importantly, the Passionist Fathers don't do anything on a financial basis without getting the sign-off from our independent finance advisory committee, which is made up of lay people who have a lot of experience in the corporate and finance world. So it was only after this committee had really gone through the process with me and had signed off on it, and we'd met with a particular investment manager who, fortunately, Thea was able to introduce us to, because one of the problems we find in Australia is that there are very few managers who provide ethical investment portfolios. So once we got that sign off, we were able to proceed. I suppose the process led me to ponder on what are the things that stop small organisations getting actually involved in taking active steps. And I suppose one is a lack of commitment from the top. If you don't have the person in charge or the decision makers on board, well, things are never going to progress. Secondly, there's often a case of inertia or I suppose an aversion to risk. There are so many competing activities that the man and their support team are involved in just managing their ministry, that often it's easier to put some of the harder decisions or the changes to one side. And so I think it's important that that people recognise that they have to get over that initial inertia if they want to move forward. And then when you do decide you want to divest, as I said before, how far do you go? Do you go all the way and not get involved in any organisation that has any involvement with fossil fuel extraction? Because, for example, in Australia, the two major supermarket chains have both, diversified their portfolios in recent years, and so they now own petrol stations. They now own hotels and clubs. They now also own liquor outlets. So they're not just selling groceries, they're selling tobacco, they're selling fuel, they're providing gaming. So it becomes quite a difficult situation, not just purely always black and white. And then I suppose the last thing is, in many cases, even if you get through all of those hurdles, it's often difficult to find the right investment portfolio or the right manager who can help you. And particularly in Australia, I think the bigger financial institutions have been a bit slow to take up the push and provide these ethical platforms that people are starting to look for more and more. Now, fortunately, we've found a person who's been able to help us in this situation. So let me quickly move on to the form that our investing has taken. Trevor Tomás, our investment manager from F-Invest, has been given a mandate by us, and that mandate is that there should be no fossil fuel extraction companies in our portfolio at all. That's easy, fundamental principle. But it also extends beyond that into a positive environment as well. So we're looking at, where possible, investments in renewable energies, in recycling, in healthcare, in education, and other areas which are social impact, positive social impact sort of investments. At this stage, we've been pragmatic about our approach to investment. So, for example, we haven't told him that he can't invest in the supermarket chains, or he can't invest in banks, for example. And as we know, banks are often the major funders for some of these fossil fuel extraction companies. But I suppose the main thing is Trevor knows that he can come back to us, and if he's got any questions on any particular investment, he can ask for our opinion. But one thing is for certain, that this portfolio is currently our most environmentally ethical portfolio. And the source of the funds that we used to start this particular portfolio were actually from our least ethically sound portfolio. So really it's a sort of a win-win. We've divested from our most offending sort of portfolio and put into a much cleaner and a more ethical fossil fuel free portfolio. I think it's also important, because I'm talking from a business manager's point of view, not as a religious. It's important to stress that one of the fundamental considerations through our process is that the revenue we earn from our investments is vital to our operations. So not only that, but that the capital is paramount, that we preserve that capital for the future operations of the order. And one of the things we found was that when we asked the question, we found that the benchmarks that our ethical investment manager is offering us are not that dissimilar to the ones that our non-ethical fund managers are also offering. So we see that we haven't had to compromise. Now, obviously, time will be the proof of that, and hopefully that will come to fruition. And once we gain more confidence that that is the case, then we'll continue to further divest from our existing portfolios into the more ethical one. It's also important to note that I continue to have conversations with our other investment managers. I think it's important not to let them off the hook and to keep the pressure on them, and to say that we are constantly looking for them to be providing us with opportunities that they're currently not providing. And we want them to come on board and become more socially aware as well. So I'd just like to finish maybe with 4 suggestions of action points that come out of our experience to date. Firstly is champions, and this is the case with most organisations when they want to bring about any sort of change. And the first thing is you have to identify individuals or groups, respected senior religious, the decision makers. You need to identify those people who have a strong commitment to ethical investing. They'll be your champions. They'll be the people who will keep the conversation going and help you get it across the line. Secondly, it's very easy to procrastinate. It's very easy to find reasons not to go ahead, to say, well, we're not quite ready yet. My recommendation is make a start. Make a commitment to making an environmentally ethical investment statement and develop a policy. Now, that policy doesn't have to be perfect. It will change. Your investment style will change. The products available will change over time. But unless you start, you won't actually get on to the roundabout. Thirdly, seek advice from trusted advisors who have the appropriate skills, knowledge, and experience. Very important. We're not the people who have all the information. There are people out there who can help us and advise us. Find those people and make it very clear to your advisors exactly what your investment objectives are and what your values are. Do your research. And then lastly, take a measured approach and build your confidence with this new product. For us, it's a new product anyway, of ethical divestment sort of environment. Build confidence and develop it and expand it over time as you build up that confidence and trust in the process. So I've gone 2 minutes over my time, sorry Thea, but that's just a brief summary of the passionate journey to ethical investing and fossil fuel divestment so far. There's a long way to go, but we were very pleased to have taken the first steps and to be able to share them tonight. We now have some skin in the game, which is great, and hopefully the hardest part is behind us, and we're hoping that over time this sort of investment will become the norm and not the exception across the entire religious community. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Simon. That was very open and succinct, and I know it's a big step for organisations to be actually open about what's happened behind their, doors and what's happened as part of their discussions. So thanks very much. The next speaker is John O'Shaughnessy, who's the Chief Finance Officer and CEO of the Franciscan Sisters of Mary. The sisters, he's worked in the congregation and its affiliates for 24 years. He also serves as a financial consultant to several other Catholic religious congregations. John previously worked in the non-profit healthcare and public accounting industries, and he remains a licensed certified public accountant. So I very much look forward to hearing John and his experience.
Great, thank you, Thea. And Simon, that was really terrific. The points that you made were very much what we experienced here at the Franciscan Sisters of Mary when you talk about the need for leadership to really take ownership, champion. We had that in a president of ours, Sister Rose Dowling. The inertia that generally you're going to experience, the need for really good advisors, same thing. I'm going to talk a bit more about our particulars and how we went about the process from the very beginning. And I'm going to try to get this started here, and hopefully you'll see it. Here we go. So just very brief profile about the Franciscan Sisters of Mary. The congregation was formed in 1872 right here in St. Louis, Missouri, Midwest, USA. For most of their history, the sisters were engaged in healthcare ministries. And while they reached their peak in vowed membership with over 700 in the 1950s, we have diminished down to fewer than 100 sisters now. So truly, we're in our twilight years now. But even with that, while our people resources are fewer, we're able to use what resources we have to do mission, and that is more on the financial resources side. So let me go through sort of the timeline of how we went about to get where we are today. In 2009, we took a very critical look at ourselves. How are we doing as a socially responsible investor? Well, we were doing pretty darn good in terms of avoiding harm, not investing in companies that were doing businesses or doing operating in a way that we found were counter to our Franciscan values. Doing fine there. Not so good on what our guidelines stated we should be doing in terms of making positive change, environmental and social change. So the challenge was clear. We needed to see, could we do this? Could we hold up to our policies on what we should be doing in terms of positive impact? What was great around that time, once we started looking, was we discovered something called mission-related investing. So could this really be real? We could make a market rate return and still generate the kinds of social and environmental benefits that essentially meant we were furthering our mission. Truly, could that be true? We had to find out. So in the next few years, we started looking at what then became more commonly referred to as impact investing. What was it? How might it look for us? What different forms it took? We were really looking around in the dark, truly. We were out there by ourselves. We went to the SOCAP conference in San Francisco a couple of years. SOCAP is short for Social Capital Markets. And the fact is, with 1,200 people there, we were the only institution, Catholic institution, represented there, which was really strange. But what we were discovering was there were potential. The other cool thing that happened was the chapter in 2011. Now, at that time, we kept our long-standing mission, which is to be the presence of the loving, serving, compassionate, healing Jesus. But then what the focus became from that point forward was the power of our attention on compassionate care of creation in collaboration with others. Compassionate care of creation, Francis, the idea of addressing climate change to the extent we could, concern about degradation of the environment, but we couldn't do it ourselves anymore. We're too few in number, and so we had to collaborate. We had to support others to do it. So we decided to go for it. We had learned enough about impact investing, and we learned enough to know we couldn't do it by ourselves. We had to have an investor advisor who really knew what they were doing. We found one, excellent, Imprint Capital. And after lots of work, and I'm not going into the details of that, we reconfigured our investment program to include $10 million for impact investing. So we shifted it over to put in things like renewable energy investments, clean energy, energy efficiency, sustainable land use, including conservation forestry, sustainable agriculture, and to a smaller extent, environmental detox. So these are the investments we've been populating our new portfolio with. We committed so far $7.5 million of the $10 million. We've made commitments to 12 investments. These are all private investments. So unlike what we had in our portfolio previously, was just securities in public companies, now we had shifted to more private investments, private equity, private credit, private real estate. And these were things that we had nothing of in terms of our investment diversification previously. So adding these things not only gave us these measurables in terms of the amount of kilowatt hours of clean energy produced and the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that were reduced and jobs created and lands conserved and so forth. Now we were actually generating returns and offsetting it with risk that was, when bound together, was really lower risk, higher return. So the best of all worlds, right, in terms of economics of your investment portfolio. So that's the part I really like to talk about with advisors in particular. So that's the summary of our impact investing program to this point. The divestment came later, so we sort of were the reverse. We did invest first, then we did divest, and divest made perfect sense at that point in time because we were investing in clean stuff. And so why would we want to continue to invest in dirty fuels, oil, gas, and coal? So the decision was easy. So we wanted to add those restrictions to the ones we already had that you can see listed there. We added to that list all the companies that are in the Carbon Underground 200. And also there's an extended list for them as well that we're also excluding. And then also the Filthy 15, which are the 15 largest coal and coal producers and users. So to do that, it's a lot easier for us because we have separate investment accounts. It would be much more difficult, if not impossible, to both apply our values, Catholic and Franciscan values, as well as divest if we were just relying on commingled funds. Can't really do it right now, not in the US, that's for sure. We're working on that. But we have fixed income portfolios. There was not really a big problem for our two managers to make adjustments to remove these companies, these additional restrictions. That's not as big of a as difficult as it is on the stock portfolio side. But we had switched to a customized index approach so that we were no longer relying on active management. It just had not worked for us in the 24 years I was here. So we had shifted to where we were essentially indexing. Now, how do you do that? You can't index, you can't buy an index mutual fund because it has all these companies you don't want to own. But now there are advisory firms like Aperio Group who we are using. Well, we'll say we want a portfolio of the Russell 1000. We want a small cap portfolio of the S&P 600. They can give us those portfolios. They can remove all those companies we don't want to own. They can optimize it so they essentially, with what we own in each portfolio, we're very closely tracking those indexes that we want to. So we don't manage risk by asking our managers to manage risk for us. We manage risk through asset allocation, and we basically are able to select portions of the market that we want to be allocated to. So we're able to do this. We're able to exclude all those companies. We're able to get market rate returns. So for us, the question of we're going to sacrifice investment return by removing fossil fuels is just flat out wrong in our case anyway. So that's the gist of what our program is, the Divest and Reinvest program. Very excited with what we're doing because the sisters are excited. They see, and we can talk about the measurables that we're having an impact on. Our returns so far are better than we would have expected. So the last thing I want to do is give you a quick plug about something else we're doing because, as I mentioned, we were in the dark. When we went out there were no other Catholic groups that we could identify that were doing impact investing. So we started a group of people that have a real enthusiasm like we do around impact investing, those that are representatives of Catholic organizations. You see just 8 of them listed here. Our mission is very simple. Through sharing our relatable experiences and learning, we expand impact investing among Catholic organizations. Relatable experiences, stories, sharing stories, connecting with each other, being in a relationship around a topic that we're passionate about. So it started in the Midwest in the US, it's moving to the East. We think we'll have other chapters in other parts of the world for that matter. If you have any interest in this or anything I've shared, there's my email address right there. Feel free to send me an email. I'd love to connect with you. Anybody that has an interest, love talking to you about it. So that's it for me.
Thanks a lot, John. So people, please do ask John through his email address any of those more detailed questions. The next panelist is Betsy Blake Bennett, who was ordained as a deacon in the Episcopal Church in 2004. Currently, she serves as Archdeacon for the Diocese of Nebraska. The focus of her diaconal ministry is environmental justice. A 2008 GreenFaith Fellow, she has been active in several religious environmental organisations and in the movement to stop the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. Her MA in philosophy is from Ohio State University. So a big welcome to Betsy Blake Bennett.
Thank you, Thea. And thank you to the other panelists.
If I could ask you to be fairly brief, I'm sorry.
I have a fairly simple story to tell, so it bears a simple telling. I'm going to give a brief overview of the story of the Episcopal Church coming to divest from fossil fuels, and then talk a little bit about what worked, about some of what worked for us that might be translatable to other religious institutions. To understand the basic process, the polity of the Episcopal Church is that we're divided into a house of bishops and a house of deputies, which consists of priests, deacons, and laity. We meet in convention at what we call years, and so we last met in June, July of 2015. Legislation comes from individual dioceses to committees at General Convention that then decide to send something on to the House of Bishops or the House of Deputies. And we need the vote of both houses in order for legislation to pass. Several of us started a conversation, I think late 2013, early 2014, about bringing divestment and reinvestment fossil fuel resolution to General Convention. And the we who did this is very much a grassroots network that all were convinced that the Episcopal Church should not be profiting from the destruction of the earth and the suffering of people. As each diocese met for its own annual diocesan council, then, several of us introduced resolutions in our own dioceses. So GreenFaith's Fletcher Harper introduced legislation in the Diocese of Newark in New Jersey in January 2015. The resolution in Nebraska passed in October 2014. The ask of the resolutions and the wording differed some from diocese to diocese, but all those resolutions that passed the diocesan conventions went on to this committee at General Convention. So our first job on the ground at the convention was to persuade the committee, first of all, to send on a divestment reinvestment resolution to the house, to one of the houses, and secondly, to make it as strong a resolution as possible. And we had a great creation care committee in place, and they did exactly that, crafted a wonderful resolution for us. It went first to our House of Bishops. The bishops voted first to amend it by removing the church pension fund from it. And that fund is technically under a different governance than the other funds that were included in the resolution. But there was a little murmuring and ill will about the bishops removing their own pension fund from this. But then, sort of to our surprise, after that little skirmish, the resolution passed with that change in the resolution. So it left in three major funds: the investment committee of our executive council, the Episcopal Church Endowment Fund, and the Episcopal Church Foundation. Our people who were working on the ground at General Convention decided to very much of the success of that passing the House of Bishops, and we brought it to the House of Deputies. We were very, very surprised that the resolution passed in the House of Deputies by a vote of 618 to 204. We had gone into this hoping that we could bring the issue of divestment before the entire General Convention. We thought it was important for the church to begin having the conversation. While we were at convention, we began to hope that it might pass, maybe squeak by. So we were amazed when it passed by 75% of the vote. In hindsight, what worked for us is first and foremost prayer. Those of us who were there were in constant prayer about this. We knew that there were people all through the church who were praying for us at this time. We stayed true to what we knew. We knew that the issue was too urgent to pass a weaker resolution to simply study the issue of divestment and reinvestment. We knew that we can't compromise with the laws of physics, so there was really no compromise kind of resolution that we could offer. And we also were all very clear in our minds that if we don't mitigate climate change, none of the church's other plans for future years that we were discussing at the convention really would matter very much. As a corollary to that, we did not get sidetracked by, let ourselves get sidetracked by the standard sorts of objections. Jenny and Nancy have both mentioned several of those sort of standard arguments that we hear about staying at the table to influence policies. We all use fossil fuels, so don't take it out on the industry. We're really asking for the choice. Or you're going to cause workers to lose their jobs, but of course we know there will be complete economic collapse if we continue using fossil fuels. As a deacon, I'm in environmental ministry because of the effects of pollution and global warming on people, and particularly on the people who live in marginal parts of our own nation or in other parts of the world that don't even cross the radar screen for most Americans. And also because of the effects on the people who will live after us. Our group was very good at this. We stayed focused on this purpose, and we helped others in the church understand that this is a justice issue. Looking back on this and preparing for this morning, I am still delighted and amazed that we managed to get the church to vote to divest from fossil fuels and reinvest in clean energy. Grassroots continues in conversation with our church pension group, and we're hopeful that there will be divestment for that group somewhere down the road. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betsy. That was great to hear that story. We've got some questions from various people who are listening in, and one of them has to do with, well, a few of them have to do with divestment versus shareholder engagement. That some people claim that shareholder engagement has actually won, gains with oil companies and so on, and that divestment's therefore too radical, really. Do any of the panelists want to comment on that question?
I'd be happy to speak to that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is a common argument that we need to stay at the table, that shareholder engagement is effective. I think that an important question is, what is your measure of effective? If we can't even get fossil fuel companies to report on the impacts of climate change on their business practices, the level of efficacy is very low. The type of actions that we would need to see from shareholder advocacy would be things like commitments to no new fossil fuel infrastructure. But we're not anywhere close to asking for those types of resolutions, things like no new fossil fuel infrastructure. And so the time horizon we're looking at, when faith communities and others have been at this for 25 years, we just don't have And this, I think, is where you can when you're in these conversations, step into your identity as a person of faith. Because when you're talking with folks who engage in this work, sometimes it tends to be a little bit confusing and won't understand. It's important to stand your ground as a person of faith and say, no, I have a moral commitment not to profit from these industries. Jesus said that if you knock on the door of a house and they won't receive you, at a certain point you have to turn around and shake the dust from your feet and move on. And that's really the case with shareholder engagement with fossil fuel companies. We have been knocking at the door for 25 years, but our presence has no teeth and our requests have no teeth if we aren't willing to walk away. So now is really the time for faith communities to start walking away.
So I'd like to chip in something on this, if I may. So I've sort of been in the middle, where I've seen sort of the militant side on the divestment, and then the militants on the shareholder advocacy side. And frankly, I think there's room for both, as long as they're sincere and they do it with all they've got. So the problem is the middle part, where we have people who sort of use, well, the reasons I don't invest are these, but truthfully, they're not doing anything about the issue. They're not engaging these companies. We've got a lot of good investors out there, ICCR supporting, that they're really fighting the battle from the inside. We're fighting the battle from the outside. Wouldn't we want two fronts to deal with this battle? So while we clearly are on the divest side, that works for us. Those who are really passionate about working and engaging these companies, I would absolutely say go for it. But do not be lukewarm. That's what Revelation says. God will spit you out. Do not be lukewarm. That cannot be acceptable. You got to go with one way or the other. That's my 2 cents.
Thanks for that passionate answer, John. Another question is, what kinds of investments best help communities that are facing high employment due to a move from fossil fuels? Does anyone have an answer to that? What kinds of investments best help communities that face high unemployment due to their moving from fossil fuels?
I'd say you have to look at the individual companies. And also if you're wanting to address issues in communities that are facing high unemployment, look at policy issues and engagement, not just through investing, but also through policy advocacy.
Okay, another question is, are there any dioceses or universities in the US using as an ethical screen all the guidelines that are in the US Catholic bishops' guidelines?
So who are groups using the bishop's guidelines? Is that the question?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, a lot are. You have some groups that basically that is what they follow. And that is what they will always follow, very closely aligned with the bishops in that regard. You've got other groups like ours that will have our own customized list of companies that, for example, we won't invest in. Looks very much similar to theirs, but theirs does not include divestment of fossil fuel companies. Ours does. We believe it should. And so, it is for, in many cases, used by many Catholic institutions, not all.
Here's another one. Is there a faith statement on the fiduciary responsibilities of church-related pension funds?
Well, every pension fund is going to have, will have to follow fiduciary rules. So, and that goes without saying, truthfully. Whether one can argue whether that includes divestment or that it of fossil fuels, or that it should not. So there's plenty of healthy debate around that. You know, we fall on the side of, no, we're not sacrificing anything. In fact, the way we've done it, we've improved our returns and lowered our risks. So it's how you go about it. There's no one set way to do it.
Is there a faith statement, though, on fiduciary responsibilities?
I'm afraid I don't have a faith statement, but I do want to note that religious communities are in a unique position when it comes to divestment, because at least in the United States, and I appreciate this is a global audience, but in the US, the Establishment Clause of the US Constitution allows for faith communities to direct their investments based on their religious values. And so there is an opportunity that when our religious values are in conflict with fiduciary duty laws, there is space to make decisions based on our values, and there's case law to support that.
Excellent answer. Thanks, Jenny. Another question is, when can we expect the Vatican to divest? That might need a Catholic to answer.
Well, I sure can't answer that, except when can we expect? So if it's actually a question about what we expect, I won't answer that. I can say that a few years ago, the USCCB held a conference in DC jointly with the Catholic Climate Covenant, and a bunch of theologians and bishops were there to kind of talk about the issue. This was, I think, maybe 2012 or so. I'm not entirely sure. A lot of these talks that were given at that conference can be found on YouTube, so that's an interesting resource to look at. We did ask the bishops who were present about what would it take to get the USCCB to move forward on this more definitively, you know, in actual action. And the answer that seems to be coming back when this is raised with bishops is, we will know that we can move forward with our diocese when our dioceses are telling us it's time to move forward. So it can seem overwhelming when you try to look at an issue like this from a grassroots perspective, but no matter which way I approach it, I keep hearing that grassroots is the way to go. Putting some heat on your parish priest will cause your parish priest to mention that he's getting some, interest and some heat on this issue to his bishop, and the bishops will start hearing from each other that, my parishes are talking about this. That really is, I think, the way that it's going to happen. I want to respond also to the question about universities and education institutions that are Catholically affiliated. Check into the University of Dayton. They did an announcement a while ago indicating that they're going to work on divesting, and I think that's been a pretty breakthrough announcement. So there are some signs here and there.
So I think with that, we're coming to an end where we promised we will keep it under 90 minutes. Hey, just to respond quickly on that last question about Vatican divestments, I would like to stress something extremely significant that happened last week. So you know that when Pope Francis released his new message for the World Day of Prayer for the Care of Creation last Thursday, Cardinal Turkson was one of the panelists in the press conference in the Vatican presenting the Pope's message. And it was the first time ever that a Vatican official publicly mentioned fossil fuel divestment with an encouraging tone about being in line with Laudato Si. So that's extremely unprecedented. I think that's really significant and really encouraging. So that happened last Thursday. But I agree with Nancy's comments, or was it Jenny, about that. First, we need to get our own Catholic institutions at a lower level to divest. We need to get dioceses, we need to get religious orders, we need to get all kind of Catholic institutions to divest. So not waiting for the Vatican to take the first step. So that said, I would like to remind everyone that next October 4th, we'll have our next joint divestment announcement for the Feast of St. Francis of Assisi, which also brings to a close the season of creation that we started celebrating last week. I encourage you to visit our website. In the GCCM website, we have a divestment hub. There you have the link on screen. It's CatholicClimateMovement.global/divest and reinvest. There's a ton of resources there. There are many of the statements that were mentioned today. There's also a toolkit. I should note that together with GreenFaith and with Thea, we've been working we put together a toolkit for Catholic communities that want to divest, and also to how to engage your own community on getting the word out. And so we hope you can check that toolkit, and hope you find it useful. And most importantly, now the goal is, as I mentioned, to grow the list of Catholic institutions that divested. Currently, it's only 11 Catholic institutions around the world that have divested. That's a very tiny list, keeping in mind that we have thousands and thousands of Catholic institutions. So hopefully today's webinar was inspiring, hopefully also looking at the cases of other Christian churches that have divested, that have been doing this for way longer than us. Hopefully that was also of inspiration. And well, with that, I would like to thank everyone. Looking forward to stay in touch. If you have any other questions or thoughts or comments, please reach out to us. In this link I'm showcasing on screen, we have our contact email, so you can send us emails through that venue as well. And hopefully you can join our divestment announcement on October 4th. Really, I would like to stress how important it is to raise our prophetic voice on this issue and make this public commitments. We know of some Catholic institutions that have divested but haven't publicly announced it yet. We really encourage everyone to make this public. It's really important to make this public stance. So thanks a lot. We're looking forward for more. We'll in the future, hopefully early next year, we'll be doing more webinars as well on this issue to continue diving deeper. And also, stay tuned for more news also on the reinvestment piece. GreenFaith and others are working on a new campaign called One for All, which is all about reinvestment in energy access in the Global South. So we'll definitely be reaching out with more information about that. So thanks, everyone. God bless and have a wonderful day or wonderful evening. And thanks to our wonderful panelists, to each of the panelists for joining us today.